The sea was on fire, and my best mate was drowning less than 3 feet away from me. That is the first clear image my mind returns to when I think about that day in the Indian Ocean. Not the alarms, not the guns, not even the ship as she died. The thing burned deepest into me is the sight of Wilkins's face, slick with oil and seawater, his mouth trying to form my name, while flaming fuel drifted slowly between us like a moving wall. I could hear him, or maybe I only remember that I heard him, but I could not reach him. 19 years old, trained as a sailor, proud to wear the king's uniform, and in that moment I was nothing more than a terrified boy, clinging to a piece of broken wood and watching his friend disappear behind burning waves. 6 hours earlier, the war did not feel like war at all. We were somewhere southwest of Ceylon, a cruiser of His Majesty's Royal Navy, cutting a clean white wake across an endless blue. The chart in the wardroom showed little more than water and the faint ghost of distant coastlines. To us on deck, there was only sea and sky, and the familiar steel plates under our boots. The Indian Ocean had a way of pretending to be harmless on days like that. The sun laid itself gently across the ship, hot but not yet cruel, and the air moved in steady, salt-laden breaths that filled your lungs and made you feel, against all reason, invincible. Routine did the rest. Habit is the closest thing to peace that a sailor gets in wartime. I had my tasks: paint to scrape, fittings to check, lines to coil, a dozen small jobs that kept the great machine alive and allowed the mind to pretend that the world beyond the hull was not tearing itself apart. The cruiser was not one of the famous names, not a battleship with a legend attached to her. She was a working ship, lean and purposeful, built to guard convoys and hunt raiders, to be present in the dull stretches of ocean the newspapers never mentioned. To me, she might as well have been the entire empire. Her corridors were my streets, her mess decks my pubs, her gun turrets my distant cathedrals. I remember that morning with painful clarity because it was so ordinary. Breakfast was the usual gray compromise between food and fuel. Tea just this side of lukewarm. Bread that remembered being fresh some other lifetime. Wilkins sat across from me at the mess table, grinning around a chipped mug as if he had never heard of death. He was a short, wiry lad from Manchester, with a laugh that sounded like someone choking on their own joke. He had a way of making even the dullest day feel like the prelude to something worth telling. He teased me about the photograph I kept in my locker, the one of my sister in her Sunday dress, and promised me that if we ever made it to shore leave together, he would introduce me to a woman who could make me forget all about waiting for letters from home. There was no grand conversation, no prophecy. Just two young men sharing bad tea on a ship that hummed with the low, constant vibration of engines doing their endless work. After breakfast, we went about our duties. Men moved along the deck, shirts already sticking to their backs, the smell of old paint and salt and sweat familiar and strangely comforting. Somewhere below, unseen hands fed fuel into hungry furnaces. Above, gulls wheeled in lazy arcs, the only creatures that seemed to truly own both sea and sky. The horizon was a perfect circle of blue in every direction. On clear days like that, you could stand at the rail and convince yourself that danger needed clouds to hide behind. We knew better, of course. We had heard the stories. Japanese aircraft striking out of empty skies, ships torn open in minutes by bombs and torpedoes, survivors machine-gunned in the water to make sure no one lived to tell the tale. Those accounts drifted through the fleet like smoke, always present, always stinging when they brushed against you, but easy enough to wave away when the sun was warm and the steel beneath your feet felt solid. Knowledge is one thing, belief is another. Until the sky itself turns against you, some part of you always thinks the worst will happen to someone else. The first hint that the day was changing came in a way I only recognized in hindsight. The wind, which had been blowing steady off the port bow, faltered. The air grew thicker, not with humidity so much as with expectation, a weight that settled on the shoulders and made every movement feel slightly delayed. The light sharpened, the colors of sea and sky seemed to gain an edge, as if the world itself had been outlined in something bright and unforgiving. It is possible that I am reading too much into that memory, that my mind has painted omens onto what was simply another gradual shift in the weather. But that is not how it feels. It feels like the moment when a crowd falls silent just before someone speaks. Then the alarm sounded. The The shipwide klaxon tore through the lazy rhythm of the day in one long metallic scream that grabbed every nerve and shook it awake. The effect was immediate. Conversations cut off mid-word. Men who had been moving with the slow, easy gait of sailors used to hot decks straightened and looked up. For a fraction of a heartbeat, there was stillness. That tiny pause between surprise and action. Training did the rest. Boots hammered on steel. The ship became a machine of motion, every man slotting into the role he had rehearsed and hoped never to play for real. The voice over the speaker was calm, almost detached. Aircraft sighted. 2 words. That was all. No numbers, no direction, no reassurance. Just the fact of it. Dropped into our ears like a stone into a still pond. Ripples ran out from that announcement through every thought, every heartbeat. The stories we had heard, the rumors of other ships and other seas, suddenly were not distant anymore. They were overhead. I ran to my station, lungs already pulling hard at the heavy air. The deck shifted under my feet as the helm responded to urgent orders, turning the ship to present a smaller target to complicate the calculations of whoever sat behind enemy gun sights. The familiar vibration of the engines deepened, a subtle change that told of more power being forced into already strained machinery. Somewhere out of sight, officers on the bridge made decisions they would live or die with. To me, in that moment, the bridge might as well have been on the moon. My world shrank to the stretch of deck around me, the metal under my hands, the slice of sky I could see above the barrels of our guns. Then I saw the first of them. At first, they were just specks, small, dark marks against the too bright sky, moving in purposeful formation. As they approached, they resolved into shapes that even a 19-year-old who had never been to the Pacific could have recognized from silhouettes in training manuals. Wings swept back, engines housed in tight nacelles, the faint glimmer of glass around the cockpit where, somewhere, a man sat looking down at us. They might have been beautiful if they had not been coming to kill us. The red roundels on their wings stood out even at distance, circles of color that seemed to mock the blue they cut through. Our guns opened up. The heavy anti-aircraft batteries began their work with a ferocity that rattled teeth. The deck shuddered under recoil. Each shot was a physical event, a punch that traveled through metal into bone. Tracer fire stitched the air in angry arcs, red and orange lines reaching up toward the incoming threat. The sound of the guns was not just loud, it was consuming. It filled the space where thoughts might have been, leaving only instinct and action. The smell of cordite and hot metal mixed with the ever-present tang of salt and oil, turning every breath into a lungful of war. For a brief moment, there was distance to it all. They were up there. We were down here. The sky between us belonged to nobody and nothing but physics. You could almost believe that the bullets and shells would forever climb and fall without ever intersecting with flesh or steel. Then the first bomb fell. You do not see the bomb leave the aircraft at that distance. You see the result. A column of water erupted near the port bow, taller than the mast, white and gray and violent. It rose with shocking speed and then collapsed back into the sea, sending waves thudding against the hull. The blast hit us a fraction of a second later, a deep, concussive thump that you felt more than heard, a blow that ran up through the soles of your feet and into your teeth. Another plume followed, closer. The enemy had the range now. The second wave came in lower. Now the aircraft were close enough that individual details stabbed at the eye. The chipped paint near a wing root, the way sunlight flashed off a canopy, the slight wobble as a pilot adjusted trim in the turbulence of exploding shells. Their engines screamed over us, a high-pitched, urgent sound that cut through even the roar of our guns. The ship heeled again as the helm fought to keep her moving, to avoid becoming a straight line in the sight of a bomb aimer. The hit, when it came, was like being inside the chest of a dying giant. The world turned white, then orange, then black. One moment I was upright, the next I was sideways, the deck no longer where it should have been. A hammer blow of pressure punched the breath from my lungs and turned the air to knives in my throat. Metal shrieked as it tore, a scream that seemed to go on forever, even though it could not have lasted more than seconds. Something hot and hard whipped past my head. I did not see what it was. I only felt the wind of it and heard it crash into someone behind me. I hit the deck awkwardly, shoulder taking most of the impact. For a heartbeat, everything was muffled, the world distant and underwater. Then sound came roaring back in disjointed fragments. A man howling somewhere nearby. The stuttering cough of a damaged gun still firing. The hiss and crackle of flames taking hold. Orders shouted in voices already hoarse. Smoke rolled across the deck in thick, suffocating waves. It was not the clean gray of coal smoke from the funnels. This was darker, heavier, full of particles that stung the eyes and clawed at the lungs. It tasted of burning fuel and scorched paint, and something uglier that I refused, even then, to name. Fire licked out from a torn section of superstructure, orange tongues feeding on anything that would burn, reaching hungrily upward. The ship had begun to list. At first, it was only a subtle lean, the kind a sailor barely notices on a normal day. But underneath the screams and the shock, another part of my mind, the part that had spent enough time at sea to know what was and was not right, registered the angle and filed it away under one word: wrong. I forced myself to my feet. My legs felt rubbery, unreliable. The deck was slick under my boots, not just with seawater, but with oil and fluids I did not want to identify. A body lay near the scupper, twisted in a way no living man's spine will tolerate. I looked at his face and for a heartbeat saw my own, then blinked and realized it was a boy from Signals whose name I could not pull out of the fog in my head. I turned away, not out of disrespect, but because there was simply no room in that moment for anything more than the next step. Somewhere along the line, the order to abandon ship began to spread. I never heard a single clear announcement, no ringing command that would have made for a tidy story later. It came in pieces, carried from mouth to mouth, anchored by the undeniable facts of our situation. Fire spreading, guns silent or jammed, the list growing more pronounced with every passing minute. Men did not wait for formal sentences. They saw what I saw and came to the same conclusion. The ship was dying. If we stayed with her, we would die too. We moved toward the boats. To call it organized chaos would be generous. There was still discipline in the way men tried to help one another, still an echo of training in the hands that worked at ropes and davits. But the ship's growing tilt turned every action into a wrestling match with gravity. Some of the boats hit the water cleanly, slapping down in a spray of white, and then bobbing, half swamped, as men scrambled to fill them. Others swung wildly and smashed against the side as the hull rolled, spilling their human cargo into the churning sea. Heat washed over us from the spreading fires. It was a different kind of heat than the tropical sun, more focused, more malevolent. It pressed against the skin, making hair curl and lungs protest. The paint on the nearby bulkheads blistered and peeled. Parts of the deck grew too hot to stand on for more than a heartbeat. Every breath pulled in smoke and ash, and the faint, sickening undertone of burning flesh. I lost sight of Wilkins in the confusion, and did not notice it at first. There were too many bodies, too many uniforms, too many urgent mouths shouting variations of the same words. Move, help, cut that line, this way, not that way. The roar of the ship's dying mixed with the rising whine of aircraft overhead, until it felt like being caught under a collapsing sky. I remember grabbing at a rope with hands I could no longer fully feel, and helping lower a boat already crowded beyond reason. Faces looked up at me from below, pale and wide-eyed, some determined, some simply stunned. When there was no room for another body in the boat, someone shouted at me to let go. The davit squealed. The ship rolled again. The boat dropped, hit the water badly, bounced, almost overturned, then miraculously righted itself amid a splash of limbs and spray. The men inside clung to one another, rebalancing, finding oars, beginning the desperate work of getting clear before the suction of a sinking cruiser dragged them under. The list was worse now. Walking became a sideways climb. Behind me, another explosion tore through the superstructure. The sound was more distant this time, less a direct blow, more an echo of the violence we had already endured, but the effect was cumulative. Something groaned deep in the hull, a long, low, grinding noise that vibrated through the metal and into my bones. The ship sagged, like a man finally dropping to his knees after taking one beating too many. I did not make a noble decision to leave the deck. There was no time for noble decisions. One moment, I was on the starboard side, grabbing for a line that led nowhere useful. The next, the ship rolled again, this time with a sickening final commitment. The deck under my boots tilted past the point where footing was possible. My body slid, boots scrabbling for purchase on wet metal, hands grasping at railings and fittings that were suddenly at the wrong angles. The sea rose up to meet me, tilted and terrible, and then I was airborne, weightless for a fraction of a heartbeat before the water hit. Cold. That was the first clear sensation. It was not the pleasant relief of a swim on a hot afternoon. It was a fist closing around chest and limbs, forcing the air out in one involuntary gasp that filled my mouth with salt and oil. Green light surrounded me, hazy and full of debris. The sound was muffled, a distant roar that seemed to come from every direction at once. My body did what bodies do when they think they are drowning. It thrashed, fought, reached for any direction that felt like up. My lungs burned, demanding air that was not yet available. Panic is a simple, pure thing when it takes over like that. Training retreats. Reason shrinks. The universe narrows to the need to break the surface. I kicked, arms windmilling, fingers brushing against something hard, and then losing it. For a moment, I was sure I would fail, that this was the sum of my war story. A few moments of struggle in dirty water while the world above burned. Then my head broke through. The first breath I pulled in was half air, half smoke. I coughed, choked, spat out a mouthful of seawater and oil, then dragged in another. The sky above me was too bright, the sun cutting through the smoke in harsh beams that made my eyes water. The sound crashed back in, unfiltered now. The distant scream of engines, the crackle of fire, the shouts of men scattered across the surface in ones and twos and crowded clumps, the groan of the ship as she continued her slow, inevitable roll. I flailed for a moment, treading water and trying to get my bearings. The cruiser loomed at a twisted angle, her side rising from the sea like the wall of a sinking city. Flames crawled along her midsection, black smoke pouring into the sky in thick, roiling columns. The proud lines of her hull and superstructure had become grotesque, angles wrong in ways that made the brain rebel. She was not a ship anymore, she was a dying thing. Debris floated everywhere. Planks, sections of rail, smashed crates, twisted metal. The sea itself was no longer the clean, deep blue it had been that morning. It was streaked with oil, great slicks of it, that shone in the sunlight with poisonous colors. In some places, the slicks burned, low, persistent flames licking across the surface, feeding on the fuel that had escaped our wounded hull. Between those patches, men struggled, shouted, or lay disturbingly still. My hand brushed against something more solid than drifting splinters. A chunk of wooden crate about as long as my arm and just wide enough to support my chest bobbed beside me. I grabbed it, fingers closing with a desperation that had nothing to do with thought. It supported part of my weight, easing the screaming in my legs. The oil on its surface made it treacherous, but I clung to it anyway, cheek pressed against the rough, slick wood, breath coming in ragged pulls. Then I saw him. Wilkins was only a few yards away, close enough that I could make out every line of his face under the mess of oil and seawater. His hair, which he had once joked could survive any barber, was plastered flat to his skull. His eyes were wide, the cheerful mischief I knew wiped clean by a fear as naked as my own. One arm flailed weakly, the other was caught in something below the surface, some invisible snag that held him in place. Between us drifted a sheet of burning fuel, a ragged strip of orange and black that moved with deceptive slowness, carried by currents I could not see. The heat from it licked at my face, even at that distance. Flames hissed and spat where droplets of seawater reached them. The air above it shimmered, turning the world on the other side into a distorted, wavering image. For an instant his features bent and twisted in that heat haze, as if even memory wanted to blur him out. His mouth moved. I could not hear his words over the chaos, but I did not need to. He was calling my name. My first instinct was to let go of the crate and swim to him. It was not a noble impulse. It was simple, automatic loyalty, the reflex of a young man who had spent months sharing jokes and cigarettes and quiet midnight fears with another. My muscles tensed, fingers flexed, ready to release my fragile support and plunge into the gap between us before the burning slick closed it. Then the ship behind me shifted again. The groan of tortured metal deepened into something like a roar. The hull, now well past the point of no return, rolled further onto her side. A wave surged outward, a great heaving of water that picked me up along with wreckage and men, and pushed us all in rough, uncaring unison. The crate under my chest lurched. My arms scrambled to keep hold. Oil stung my eyes, forcing them shut for a second that felt far too long. When I forced them open again, the burning line of fuel had moved. It slid across the space between us, closing the gap like a curtain. One moment I could see Wilkins's outstretched hand, his fingers opening and closing as if trying to catch hold of something that was not there. The next, fire passed slowly in front of him, a drifting wall that crackled and snapped, its edges breaking apart into smaller tongues that lapped at the surrounding water. For a heartbeat, his face appeared in the gaps between the flames, a stuttering series of images that will haunt me until I die. Then the slick thickened, the fire intensified, and he was gone behind it. I shouted his name. I am sure I did. The sound vanished into the greater noise of catastrophe. There is a particular kind of helplessness that lives in that memory, a flavor of guilt that has never fully washed out, no matter how many years have passed. I could not go through the fire to reach him. The rational part of me knew that even as my arms shook with the desire to try, the heat was too intense, the oil too hungry, the distance deceptive. To let go of the crate and push toward him would have meant falling short and joining him in whatever awaited on the other side of that burning curtain. Survival in that moment demanded betrayal of instinct. I held on. Around us the battle continued. The guns of our cruiser fell mostly silent as she choked on water and flame. The beating heart of her machinery stuttered and failed. But in the sky above, the Japanese aircraft still moved with the same cold purpose they had shown in their approach. Some wheeled away, seeking other prey in the scattered ships of our group. Others circled back, their dark silhouettes carving arcs against the too bright blue. A lifeboat wallowed not far from me, maybe 30 or 40 yards off, crammed with men. It rode so low in the water that every wave threatened to spill it. Oars dipped and rose as those inside tried to pull away from the sinking ship, away from the burning slicks, toward some illusion of safety in open water. Faces turned repeatedly toward the sky, watching the aircraft with the hunted look of animals who know the predator is not done. One of the bombers broke from its path and began to descend. It was a clean, deliberate movement. The nose dipped. The wings tilted slightly. Its line of approach changed from a broad arc to a direct line, aimed at the patch of sea where the overloaded boat and nearby survivors struggled. Even from where I floated, half blind with smoke and salt, I could see the intent in that change. The stories we had heard about strafing runs on survivors suddenly had an outline, a shape, a face. The engine screamed louder as it came down, the sound drilling into my skull. Time, in moments like that, does something strange. It stretches and stutters, elongating seconds into lifetimes while still moving ruthlessly forward. I watched the aircraft grow, details sharpening like a photograph coming into focus, the mottled paint on its fuselage, the glint of metal along the barrels of its wing-mounted guns, the red insignia on the underside of the wings, stark against the sky, the cockpit canopy, a bubble of glass behind which a shadowed figure moved. The men in the boat saw it too. Their bodies stiffened. Some ducked instinctively, though there was nowhere to hide. Others simply stared up, eyes wide, faces draining of what little color they had left. A few raised their arms, not in any rational attempt to shield themselves, but as if to ward off the fate bearing down on them. The oars faltered. The boat lost speed. It hung there on the water, a bright, helpless target. I waited for the flare of muzzle flashes, for the tearing line of bullets to stitch the sea and the frail wooden hull into red foam. I imagined, in a series of jagged flashes, what it would look like. Men jerking as rounds tore through them, wood splintering, water exploding upward in sprays as shots went wide, the lifeboat breaking apart under the impact, the sea around it blooming with more oil, more blood, more wreckage. The bomber came closer until I could see the pilot's head clearly. He was just a man. That was the shock of it. Not a faceless instrument of fate, not some abstraction of enemy, but a human being sitting in a cramped cockpit, hands on controls, eyes looking down at the mess we had become. For a moment, through the warped shimmer of heat and distance, it seemed as if he was looking directly at me. That is almost certainly a lie my memory tells. A cinematic flourish my mind has added over the years. But in the story that has played behind my eyes for decades, our gazes meet in that instant. The bomber lined up perfectly with the lifeboat. And then, at the last possible moment, it rolled away. It was not a hesitant wobble. It was a clean, decisive movement. One wing lifted, the other dipped, and the aircraft banked hard to one side, angling up and away from the boat and the scattered men around it. No guns fired, no bullets tore the water. The roar of the engine shifted in tone as the aircraft climbed, the sound sliding from an attacking shriek to the more distant bellow of a machine simply passing overhead. The lifeboat rocked in the wake of its passage, survivors clutching at each other to stay upright. For a heartbeat, there was no reaction. Shock held us all. We had braced for impact, for pain, for the final proof that the stories were true and that mercy had no place above a war-torn sea. Instead, nothing happened. The weapon passed, unused. The predator flew on. Air rushed into my lungs in a ragged gasp I had not realized I was holding back. All around, the chaos of sinking steel and burning oil went on. Men still struggled in the water. The cruiser behind us slid deeper, her bow rising, her stern dragging down, until she reached a point of balance that lasted a long, terrible moment before tipping. The roar of her final plunge rolled across the surface like thunder, but in that small slice of time, in that patch of sea where an aircraft had chosen not to kill, a different kind of silence settled. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of the expected blow. Floating there, arms wrapped around a stained piece of wood, face streaked with oil and salt and smoke. I did not know yet that I would wake in my bed as an old man half a century later and still feel the heat of that fire. I did not know that I would see Wilkins's vanishing face every time I closed my eyes on certain nights. I did not know that one day, long after the sea had calmed and the wreck had rusted on the ocean floor, I would learn the name of the man in that cockpit and the reason he did not press the trigger. In that moment, all I knew was this: I was still alive, and I had no idea why. The first time I killed a man from the sky, I could not bring myself to look down at his face. Years later, on that day above the Indian Ocean, I could not bring myself to look away. My name does not matter as much as the number they painted on my aircraft. That number was how the ground crews knew me, how the officers referred to my machine in their reports, how the enemy, if he survived, would remember me if he remembered anything at all. I was a pilot of the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service, trained to believe that the sky was our rightful domain, and that the ocean below existed mainly to reflect the glory of our aircraft and swallow our enemies. By the time we flew out over the Indian Ocean to strike the British ships, I had already seen enough fire and metal and falling wreckage to know that the sky was not a place of glory at all. It was simply another battlefield, and battles were places where things broke. We had launched before dawn from the carrier, the deck still slick with night air and dew. The ship rolled gently under my boots as I walked toward my aircraft, the familiar lean shape of it rising out of the dimness like a predator resting before the hunt. Ground crew moved around it with efficient silence, checking lines, securing panels, feeding fuel into its hungry tanks. They did not waste words on us. There was nothing left to say. We had all heard the briefings. We knew our targets. We knew the range we had to fly, the headings to hold, the altitudes to maintain. We knew that somewhere beyond the horizon, British ships were cutting their own white scars across the same water, and that today, our task was to erase them. I climbed into the cockpit and the world narrowed. Inside, everything was cramped and precise. Instruments crouched in their places, dials and needles and switches arranged in a pattern my hands knew better than my own handwriting. The smell was a mix of fuel and oil, and the faint, lingering trace of other missions. Other days when I had sat here and pushed the throttle forward and trusted the engine to pull me into the sky. The canopy frame curved around me, a metal skeleton that held thin sheets of glass between me and the empty air. Beyond it, the deck crews moved like ghosts in the half-light, their faces turned up toward us with an expression I recognized too well. The look of men who must stay behind and wait for news they cannot influence. Orders had come from men whose uniforms were sharper than ours and whose hands were soft. They spoke of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere and the divine destiny of our empire. They spoke of the weakness of Westerners, of their decadence, their cowardice, their inevitable collapse under the righteous blows of our forces. They did not speak of the first time I had watched a ship burn with men still on deck. They did not speak of the way a man's body twists when bullets tear through bone and muscle. They did not speak of the faces that appeared in my dreams, pale blurs of foreign features that stared up at me as my shadow passed over them. They told us again and again that the enemy had no honor. They told us that the British were arrogant and complacent, that they hid behind their navies and their flags, that they had fattened themselves on Asia and now squealed because someone else had found the knife. They told us that mercy wasted ammunition. They told us that a ship not only had to be sunk, but its survivors had to be denied the chance to fight again. They told us many things. We listened because we were young and they were older, and the world they described made it easier to climb into a cockpit and prepare to send explosives down onto decks where other young men stood. I did not sleep much in those days. When I did, I dreamed in fragments, the curve of a wing as it dipped toward the sea, the blossom of fire where a bomb found its mark, the way water leapt high when metal and explosives met its surface. The memory that came back most often was not my first kill or my most successful mission. It was a small thing, a detail I had not even noticed properly until later. A man on the deck of a ship frozen for an instant in the gap between alarm and action, looking up. I'd been lining up my run, bombs already falling, and for a heartbeat, he had stood there, tiny in the vastness of the ocean, his face turned to the sky, as if trying to see the shape of his own death. Then the blast had erased him, and there had been nothing left to look at. On the morning of the Indian Ocean operation, the air above the carrier was cool and tasted of salt when I cranked the engine and felt its vibration build under my hands. The propeller blurred into a disc. The ground crew pulled away the chocks. The signal officer raised his flag, then dropped it, and the deck in front of me became a narrow path toward the edge of the world. I pushed the throttle forward. The machine surged. The tail lifted. The carrier's deck rushed past on either side. For a heartbeat, there was the familiar lurch as the end of the deck came and went beneath my wheels, and then we were in the air, held up by nothing but speed and lift and the unsteady faith of a man strapped into a seat above hundreds of meters of open water. We formed up with the others, our aircraft taking their places in the sky like pieces of metal chalked into a diagram. The sun climbed higher, turning the horizon into a line of hard light. Below us, the Indian Ocean spread out in all directions, an enormous mirror that reflected the pale blue above. From that height, it was impossible to believe that anything we did could really matter to it. Ships were tiny smudges on its surface, even when you were close enough to drop a bomb. Men were smaller still. The ocean had outlived empires. It would outlive us. Our mission, our war, our carefully planned attack paths and fuel calculations, all of it felt both immense and insignificant as we flew. Radio chatter crackled in my ears, short bursts of language, course corrections, distance checks, warnings about flak. There was no talk of fear or hope or doubt. Those things were not welcome over the net. They lived in the silences between transmissions, in the tightness of a pilot's jaw, or the way his hand hovered a fraction of a second longer than necessary over a switch. My own fear sat in my chest like a stone, familiar now, not sharp enough to cripple, but never quite dissolving. I had learned to fly with it. Sometimes I thought it was the only honest thing left in me. The first sight of the British cruiser came as a change in the pattern of the sea. Smoke on the horizon, a thin gray line that did not belong to cloud or mist. As we drew closer, that line thickened, resolved into distinct shapes, a hull cutting through the water, masts and funnels reaching up, the tiny ant-like movement of men on deck. Even before we reached bombing altitude, I could see the glint of sunlight on metal, the way the wake fanned out behind the ship like a long white scar. It was a beautiful sight, if you could disconnect it from what we were there to do. We adjusted our formation, climbing, spreading out to begin our runs. I checked my instruments again, more from habit than necessity. Altitude, speed, fuel, bomb release mechanisms, everything in the green. My hands moved over the controls with a familiarity that was almost automatic. The enemy ship grew larger in the cockpit glass, its lines sharpening. I could see the shapes of gun turrets now, the angular shadows of superstructure, the thin black mouths of anti-aircraft guns beginning to turn toward us. They were not surprised for long. They had seen us. They recognized the silhouette of death when it grew in their sky. As we turned onto our attack heading, the first bursts of flak reached up toward us. Black puffs appeared in the air ahead, then behind, then uncomfortably close. each one a sudden flower of smoke with an iron heart. The explosions were small, nothing like the bombs we carried, but they did not need to be large to kill. A few fragments in the wrong place were enough to rip open a fuel tank or sever a control cable. The aircraft jolted as shock waves brushed past. I felt each one through the frame, through the seat, up into my spine. The guns of the cruiser hammered away, trying to put shells into the empty space we were about to occupy. It was a strange kind of conversation. They spoke in explosions. We answered in gravity. I rolled into my dive, the nose tilted down. The deck of the British ship rose in my sights, swelling from a toy model into a full, detailed target. The lines of the hull became clear, the wakes of smaller objects in the water around it, perhaps escort vessels, perhaps debris from earlier hits, etched white scars into the sea. I could see figures running along the deck, tiny shapes darting between gun emplacements, some heading toward positions, others toward ladders, others toward whatever they thought might save them. At that speed, at that angle, they were just movement. I did not allow myself to think of them as men with lives and families and histories as tangled and precious as my own. The bomb release was almost gentle. A mechanical click, a slight upward lift as the weight left the aircraft. The bomb itself dropped away, a dark cylinder falling toward the ship's midsection. I pulled up, muscles straining against the G-force, the horizon swinging crazily, the target sliding out from under me. For a moment, I saw the bomb as a small speck against the pale gray of the deck. Then I had to look away, eyes scanning for other aircraft, for threats, for any sign that I had wandered into the path of a comrade or a shell. The explosion lit the underside of my aircraft with a brief, hellish light. Even without looking back, I knew it had been a good hit. The shockwave thumped against the fuselage. A column of fire and smoke climbed into the sky, chasing us, fingers of flame reaching for a machine already beyond their grasp. When I risked a glance over my shoulder, the British cruiser was no longer a clean, ordered shape. A jagged wound ran along her deck, smoke pouring out of it in thick, angry pulses. One of her gun positions had vanished, replaced by twisted metal and the scattered remnants of men who had been standing there only breaths before. Our formation broke apart as each pilot completed his run and peeled away, climbing, circling, preparing for another pass, or moving to secondary targets. Below, the cruiser began to list, a slow, almost dignified tilt that spoke of terrible damage inside her hull. Fire licked along her midsection. The once proud line of her superstructure was marred by gaps and wreckage. From above, it looked almost abstract, like a painting of destruction. Only when I focused on the small details did the reality assert itself. Dots in the water, men. They had started to abandon ship. Tiny dark shapes spilled from the wounded cruiser, dropping into the sea or climbing into boats that swung precariously on their davits before crashing into the waves. The clean blue around the ship grew dirty, stained by leaking fuel and smoke. Debris floated, spreading out in a loose ring. From my altitude, the individual struggles were almost invisible, but I knew they were happening. Arms flailing, hands grabbing for floating wreckage, voices shouting names and prayers and curses in accents I had never heard in person. The radio crackled again. New orders. We were to continue the attack. Our bombs had torn the ship open, but she was not yet gone. Torpedo planes would move in, finishing what we had started. We were to strafe as necessary, suppressing any remaining anti-aircraft fire, disrupting damage control efforts, denying the enemy the chance to save his vessel or his men. There was no mention of survivors. There did not need to be. We knew what was expected. A man in the water is not simply a man. He is potential resistance, a future enemy. That was how they had taught us to think. I banked, bringing the wrecked ship and the spreading pattern of debris back into my forward view. The cruiser was dying. There was no question of that now. She lay at a sick angle, one side already dangerously low, the other lifted, exposing a smear of hull that had not been designed to see the open air. Fire burned along her length, some of it bright and fierce, some of it guttering as seawater fought back. The water around her was a chaotic field of movement and color. Black oil, gray wreckage, blue waves, pale dots of flesh and cloth. As I leveled out, the lifeboats came into clearer view. One of them in particular drew my eye. It was overloaded, packed with men sitting shoulder to shoulder, their weight driving the little craft deep into the water. Oars flailed at the waves, trying to pull the boat away from the doomed cruiser before the suction of its eventual sinking dragged them under. Even from above, I could see the strain in their movements, the frantic urgency. Other survivors clung to pieces of wood nearby, kicking weakly, trying to angle themselves toward the boat. It was a picture of desperate, disorganized survival. I rolled my aircraft slightly, bringing the boat into the center of my forward view. It was not a conscious decision in the beginning. It was habit. A pilot lines up a target. A pilot assesses. A pilot acts. The guns in my wings were loaded and ready. The trigger sat under my finger, a small piece of metal that weighed almost nothing and yet carried with it a gravity that grew heavier every year I survived the war. I had been told many times that men in lifeboats were legitimate targets. If they reached land, they would be patched up, given new weapons, sent back to sea to kill our own ships. Better to remove them now, while they were weak and exposed. As I descended, the details sharpened. The lifeboat was no longer just a pale shape on the water. I could see individual faces now, turned up toward the sound of my engine. Some shone white through streaks of oil, eyes wide and reflecting a sky I had come to loathe. Others were marked with blood and grime, features contorted by exhaustion and fear. A few men raised their hands, not in any pose I could call surrender, but in some half-formed instinct to shield their heads from bullets that had not yet been fired. Beyond the boat, scattered survivors floated alone or in pairs, clinging to debris. One of them clutched a broken piece of crate, his arms wrapped around it with a grip that spoke of the last strength in his body. Another was half hidden behind a patch of burning fuel, the flames sending up greasy smoke that distorted his outline. The sea undulated under them all, indifferent and implacable. I should have squeezed the trigger. My instructors would have expected it. My superiors, reading the after-action report, would have nodded approvingly at the efficiency. The men in the other aircraft around me had done it before and would do it again. We had all seen it. Boats torn apart by gunfire. Bodies jerked and flung by impacts we inflicted from the safety of altitude and speed. It was not a popular topic in conversation, but it sat in the quiet spaces between us, an unspoken proof of our commitment to the cause we had been told was sacred. The boat grew larger in my sights. My thumb flicked the safety off the gun controls. In that moment, something happened that no training manual had prepared me for. One of the men in the water, near the overloaded boat, lifted his head. Oil had turned his hair and skin dark, but under the streaks I could see the pallor of his face. His eyes found my aircraft fixed on it. For a heartbeat, as I roared down toward him, it felt as if we were the only two beings on the entire ocean. The noise of the engine, the shouts from the radio, the memory of instructors and officers and slogans, all of it faded, leaving only that gaze. He did not shake his fist at me. He did not beg. His mouth moved, forming a word I could not hear and would never know. There was no heroism in his expression, no noble resignation. There was something much simpler and far more terrible, the raw, instinctive refusal to die. It was not directed at me as a man. It was directed at the universe itself. It was the same refusal I had felt in my own chest the first time tracer fire came too close, and I had realized with absolute clarity that I did not want to die for any emperor, any flag, any idea. My finger hovered over the trigger. The guns were lined up. The boat was directly ahead, at the perfect angle and distance. A short burst would rip through wood and flesh alike, sending splinters and bodies into the air, turning that little cluster of survivors into a stain on the already stained sea. From my own cockpit, it would be a simple visual event, a flash, a scatter, a momentary satisfaction of having completed a task. Instead, my hand moved in a different way. I eased pressure on the stick, rolled the aircraft, let the nose swing away from the boat and the men in the water. The horizon tilted. The lifeboat slid across my field of view and then out of it, the men's faces vanishing from my sight as if someone had snuffed out a lantern. The roar in my ears changed pitch as the engine responded to the new attitude. The guns in my wings stayed silent, their ammunition untouched. For a heartbeat, I wondered if some external force had taken my hands. That was nonsense, of course. No spirit had reached into the cockpit. No ancestor had guided my fingers. It had been me, my hands, my decision. The realization crashed into me with almost physical force. I, a pilot of the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service, had disobeyed the intent of my orders. I had deliberately spared the lives of enemies I had been taught to see as little more than obstacles in the path of my nation's destiny. Fear followed immediately on the heels of that thought. Not fear of the men I had left alive. They could not hurt me up there. If anything, they were a reminder of how much power I held in that moment, power I had chosen not to use. The fear was for myself, for what would happen if word of my hesitation reached the wrong ears. Commanders did not look kindly on pilots who chose their own targets according to private moral calculations. The Empire had little patience for conscience. Conscience got in the way of efficiency. I told myself, quickly and with the practiced speed of a man used to justifying his own survival, that my decision had been tactical. The ship was still a threat. There might still be guns functioning, men at damaged control stations doing everything they could to keep her afloat. My ammunition would be better used there, I told myself, suppressing those efforts, ensuring the ship's final destruction. Firing on the lifeboat would have been wasteful, I argued in the privacy of my own mind. Expenditure of rounds on targets that no longer mattered. I would write my report that way, if anyone asked. The truth sat cold and heavy underneath the excuses. I had looked into the eyes of a man in the water and seen not an enemy, but myself, turned inside out. A being stripped of rank and uniform and anthem, reduced to the simple, furious desire to go on living. In that fraction of a second, the slogans and speeches and maps pinned to briefing room walls had seemed very small compared to the enormity of that desire. I could not bring myself to erase it with the twitch of one finger. As I climbed back to rejoin the others, the radio crackled with terse updates. Torpedoes away, hits observed, ship listing heavily, secondary explosions. Some pilots reported their own strafing runs, their own passes over wreckage where debris and bodies mingled until they were almost indistinguishable. No one mentioned mercy. No one asked if anyone else had pulled away from a perfect shot. I kept my mouth shut, voice steady as I confirmed my position and took new vectors. Below, the British cruiser slipped further into the sea. From altitude, the process had a terrible, detached grace. The stern went under first, dragging the rest of the ship after it. Water rushed across decks where men had walked that morning, swallowing guns and rails and ladders. The bow rose, pointed briefly at the sky, like a finger accusing the heavens, then slid down. Bubbles and debris marked the place where steel met deep water. Oil spread in thicker patches. The lifeboats and survivors scattered, tiny, fragile things on a surface that did not care. For the rest of the mission, I did not look too closely at the wreckage fields. I focused on the positions of other aircraft, on the need to conserve fuel, on the possibility of enemy fighters appearing. On the flight back to the carrier, I watched the line of the horizon ahead instead of the one behind. My hands moved through their familiar routines on landing. Throttle back, flaps down, wheels kissing the deck more roughly than I would have liked, but still intact. Ground crew rushed in. The engine died. The sudden silence after hours of noise was almost overwhelming. Later, in the debriefing, I spoke of the bomb hit, of the angle of my dive, of the anti-aircraft fire I had encountered. I did not mention the lifeboat. No one asked. My report went into the neat stack of documents that would be filed, analyzed, perhaps quoted in some staff officer's summary. On paper, I had done my duty. On paper, the attack had been a success. That night, when I finally lay down in my hammock, exhaustion dragging at my limbs, sleep came in fits and starts. When it did, it brought with it images that were sharper and more unforgiving than any photograph. The face of the man in the water, eyes fixed on my approaching aircraft, the boat full of soldiers huddled together, waiting for a blow that did not fall. My own gloved hand on the control column, the guns silent under my wings. Years later, when my hair had turned gray and my hands shook even without the vibrations of an engine around them, I would sit at a table and read an account of that same day, written from the other side. A British sailor clinging to a piece of wood in an oil-slick sea, remembering a Japanese bomber that lined up on his overcrowded boat and then banked away. He would write that he never knew why. He would write that he had spent a lifetime wondering about the man in that cockpit. As I closed the book on that account for the first time, the memory of my finger hovering over the trigger came back with a clarity that made my throat tighten. I had not expected, when I rolled away from that boat, that the eyes looking up at me would still be with me decades later. I had not expected that a single moment of disobedience, born of something I barely understood in myself, would become the point where two lives remained joined across an ocean and half a century. On the day itself, above that burning patch of the Indian Ocean, all I knew was this. For the first time in the war, I had chosen not to kill when I easily could have. And once a man has stepped even a little outside the line painted for him by others, he can never stand in that line quite as comfortably again. By the time the letter found me, most of the men who had been there that day were already dead. It arrived on a Wednesday morning in a building that smelled of boiled vegetables and disinfectant, where the days all looked the same and the nights were just longer stretches of dim light and creaking pipes. The nurses called it a care home. I sometimes thought of it as a waiting room. My world had shrunk to a small room with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, a chair, and a window that showed me a patch of English sky, more often gray than blue. I had made my peace, or something like it, with the idea that the war I carried inside my head would remain mine alone until I went into the ground. The letter was thin, in a white envelope with foreign stamps lined along the top like medals. The postmark was Japanese. That alone was enough to make my fingers tighten when the nurse handed it to me. She did not notice. To her, it was just another piece of mail, like the charity appeals and appointment reminders that came and went without leaving a mark. She smiled, said something about it being nice to get post from abroad, and left me with the envelope and the quiet hiss of the radiator. I turned it over in my hands for a long time before opening it. The paper was good quality, heavier than what I was used to, with a faint texture under my fingertips. The name on the front was mine, written carefully in slightly awkward but perfectly legible English letters. There was no return address on the outside, only the stamp and the inked circle of the postmark. For a moment, I considered putting it aside, saving it for later, the way one saves a favorite biscuit from a dwindling plate. But time was a luxury I no longer pretended I had in abundance. I slid a thumb under the flap and tore. There were 2 sheets of paper inside, folded neatly. The first was a letter. The second was a photocopy of a book page. The letter was written in English, the handwriting precise and slightly stiff, the work of someone who had learned the language in classrooms and careful practice rather than on streets and playgrounds. At the top, in small, neat characters, was the sender's name, Takeshi Yamada. Underneath, in brackets, was a brief explanation. Former pilot, Imperial Japanese Navy. I read that line 3 times before moving on. He began with an apology for writing to a stranger. Then he explained that he was not entirely sure I was the right man. He had spent years searching, he wrote, through veterans associations and public records, trying to match a set of details he carried in his memory to the scattered fragments of other people's lives. A date in 1942. A position in the Indian Ocean, the sinking of a British cruiser, reports of survivors in a particular lifeboat group, later rescued by another ship, a name mentioned in a memoir he had found, belonging to a young sailor who lost a friend in the water that day. My name. He had found it in a book I had never intended to have read, much beyond the small circle of people who still cared about such things. A publisher had convinced me, years before, that there was some value in putting my memories onto paper. I had not written it as a grand history. It was just my story as I remembered it. The sinking, the fire, Wilkins's face, the bomber that had lined up on our boat and then, inexplicably, banked away. When the book came out, it did what most books do, made a small ripple, and then sank into the deep water of other people's lives. Not everyone had forgotten it. In his letter, Yamada wrote that he had been in that bomber. He described the angle of his approach, the shape of our cruiser as it burned, the way the sea had looked from his cockpit. He described the overloaded lifeboat, riding low in the oil-streaked water, the men packed so tightly inside it that there was barely room to move an arm. And he described, without flourish, without drama, the moment he had lined us up in his sights, his finger resting on the trigger, and then rolled away. As I read, the room around me fell away, the radiator hiss, the faint sounds of a television down the hall, the muted thump of a cart being wheeled past my door. All of it receded until there was only the paper in my hands and the ghost of sunlight on burning waves. I could smell oil again. I could feel the rough edge of that crate under my chest, the ache in my arms, the the sting of smoke in my eyes. I could see Wilkins disappearing behind the wall of fire. And for the first time, I could also see the scene from somewhere else, from above, through a pane of glass, with engine vibrations in my bones and orders in my ears. Yamada wrote that he had spent decades trying to forget certain missions. He had flown over many ships, he said, dropped bombs on decks and docks and fuel depots, watched explosions blossom on the surface of the sea and on land. He had seen men run, fall, vanish in smoke. Some of those moments came back to him in sleep, but most faded into the gray blur that war becomes when you carry too much of it for too long. There were, however, a few images that remained sharp. One of them was that lifeboat in the Indian Ocean, and the face of a man half hidden behind oil and smoke, looking up at him with a defiance that had nothing to do with uniforms or flags. He remembered not firing. He remembered the silence of his guns as he passed over us. He remembered, with painful clarity, the instant afterwards when he realized what he had not done and what that might mean if anyone else had seen. He wrote of the justifications he had constructed to live with that choice. He told himself, as he had told his superiors, that his ammunition was better used on the ship, on disabling guns and damage control parties, on making sure the cruiser did not limp away to fight again. He told himself that the men in the boat were already half dead, that the ocean and the sun and their wounds would finish what his bombs had started. He told himself that it had been a tactical decision, not a moral one. But beneath the neat sentences in his letter, I could feel the weight of a different truth pressing through. He had seen me, he wrote. He did not know my name then, of course. To him, I had been just another face. But something in that face had reached him. It had shown him not an enemy, not a symbol of Western arrogance or imperial greed, but a reflection, a man who wanted to go on breathing, a man who did not want to die in oil-stained water beneath a foreign sun, a man who, in that moment, wanted exactly what he wanted when tracer fire stitched the sky too close to his own cockpit. He could not bring himself to erase that want with a burst of gunfire. At the bottom of the first page, his script wavered slightly. He wrote that he had thought of that decision often in the years that followed. There were times when he cursed himself for it, imagining some British shell fired later by one of the men he had spared slamming into a Japanese ship, killing comrades whose faces he knew and loved. There were other times when, lying awake in the long, quiet hours of peacetime, he wondered if that single refusal to kill had been the only truly human thing he had done in those years. He turned the question over and over, like a stone in his hand, feeling its edges, but never quite finding a comfortable way to hold it. On the second page, his tone changed. He had found my book, he explained, by accident. A younger relative, interested in the war, had brought it to him, pointing out the account of a sailor who described a Japanese bomber that had come down on an overcrowded lifeboat and then veered away. The details matched his memory too closely to ignore. The date, the rough position in the Indian Ocean, the type of ship, the way the survivor wrote of oil on the water and fire, moving between him and a drowning friend. He read and reread that passage, he wrote, and for the first time in decades, he let himself believe that that moment in the sky had mattered to someone other than himself. Then he began to search for me. It had not been easy. Time had done what time does, scattering people and records, burying some under layers of paper and others under soil. He wrote of letters to associations, of inquiries sent politely and patiently to British naval groups, of long spans of silence broken occasionally by replies that almost, but not quite, led him to my door. When he finally saw my name attached to a current address, he said, his hands had trembled more than they had the first time he took a carrier landing in rough seas. At the end of the letter, he wrote something that made me put the paper down and close my eyes. He wrote that he was old now, as I must be, that his health was poor, that he did not know how many more years or months the doctors would give him. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not offer excuses. He asked only for the chance to meet, if my strength allowed it, or failing that, to send one more letter. He wanted, he said, to look into my face without glass and altitude between us, and to know whether the man he had spared had found any peace. My hands were not steady when I picked up the photocopied page. It was from a Japanese edition of a wartime memoir, the caption underlined in ink. It described a young pilot who, during a successful attack on a British cruiser in the Indian Ocean, had lined up a lifeboat filled with enemy sailors and then, at the last moment, had been unable to fire. The author, another pilot, wrote of this as an oddity, an example of individual weakness in the face of duty. The passage was brief, almost dismissive, but someone, Yamada, I assumed, had underlined a single sentence. He could not forget the eyes of one man in the water. I sat for a long time with both sheets of paper on my lap, the afternoon light shifting across the floor, the radiator ticking as it cooled and warmed in its own small cycle. The nurses came and went. A trolley rattled past. Somewhere down the corridor, someone laughed at something on a television show. All of it seemed very far away. The war, which had so often felt like a storm long passed over, was suddenly here again, not as noise and fire, but as a thin line of ink crossing an ocean between two old men who had once been very young. I thought of Wilkins. I thought of his face behind the wall of flame, the way his mouth had formed my name, the way his hand had reached for something that was never there. I thought of all the years I had carried the guilt of not being able to reach him, of surviving when he had not. For a long time I had believed that my survival had been an accident, a quirk of currents and angles and timing. Now, with Yamada's careful English lying on my knees, I had to accept that somewhere up in that screaming sky, a man I had been taught to hate had chosen deliberately to let me live. It did not erase the dead. It did not bring Wilkins back from behind that curtain of burning fuel. It did not undo the shells that had torn our ship apart or the bombs that had opened our hull to the sea, but it moved something inside me that I had thought was long since set in rust. The home director was surprised when I asked about travel. At my age, trips abroad were not standard. There were forms to fill in, doctors to consult, family to reassure. My niece, who handled most of my affairs, was skeptical at first. Japan was a long way, she said. The journey would be tiring. The food would be different. What if something happened? I listened to her worries, and then, when she paused for breath, told her quietly that the man who had written to me had once had the power to kill me, and had chosen not to. After a moment, she nodded and went to get a pen. The flight was a blur of recycled air, cramped seats, and the strange dislocation that comes when your body crosses time zones faster than your mind can follow. I slept in snatches, waking each time with the memory of engine noise in my ears that was not the steady hum of a passenger jet, but the harsher, more intimate growl of a wartime propeller. Through the small oval window, clouds slid past in endless layers. Somewhere below, I knew, the ocean still moved as it always had. Tokyo was all light and motion and noise, a crush of people and signs and trains that seemed to run on an entirely different rhythm from the slow, ordered days of my English care home. But from there, we traveled to a quieter place, a small town with narrow streets and low houses, where the air smelled faintly of earth and cooking rice, and something floral I could not name. Yamada's house was modest, a single-story building with a tiny garden in front, where someone had coaxed neat rows of plants out of the soil. A wind chime hung near the door, its metal pieces tinkling softly in the breeze. My niece walked beside me, but in that moment I felt as if I were moving alone, each step heavier than the last. His daughter opened the door. She was a woman in late middle age, with careful manners and eyes that assessed me gently, as if weighing the stranger her father had summoned from the far side of a lifetime. She bowed. I nodded awkwardly, and between us we made something that was not exactly graceful, but was sincere. She led us inside, through a hallway that smelled faintly of old paper and tea, into a room where the light fell softly through shoji screens. He was sitting in a chair by the window. Age had done to him what it does to all of us. His hair was thin and white, his face lined with those fine, complex maps of time that no artist has ever truly captured. His hands, resting on the arms of the chair, trembled slightly even when they were still. A walking stick leaned nearby. On a small table beside him lay my book, its cover more worn than the copy I had at home, a bookmark peeking out from halfway through. When he saw me, he tried to stand. For a moment, his body did not quite obey. His hands gripped the chair arms, legs pushing, muscles remembering movements now harder than they had once been. I stepped forward without thinking and put my hand on his shoulder, gently pressing him back down. His skin under my palm was thin and warm. For an instant, our eyes met at the same level. In those eyes, I saw the pilot and the old man at once. We did not speak immediately. There was too much language between us, and yet not enough. Our respective families stood back, giving us a space that felt both intimate and enormous. The silence was not empty. It was full of burning ships, of screaming engines, of young men shouting over wind and fire. It was full of all the words we had not said for 70 years. When we did speak, it was in simple sentences. His English was better than my Japanese, which was to say that he could form whole thoughts, and I could manage only a few words of greeting. So we stayed with English, slow and careful on his tongue, rusty but functional on mine. He apologized for his accent. I told him mine was worse. The small joke broke something tight in both our chests, and we smiled, awkward and genuine. He said he was glad I had come. I told him I was glad he had written. We talked, in the hours that followed, not so much about the war as about our lives around it. He told me he had married after the surrender, that he had worked as a mechanic, that he had 2 children, that he still woke sometimes in the night with the sensation of controls under his hands and empty air under his feet. I told him about my years in the merchant service after the Navy, about my wife who had died a decade earlier, about the way certain smells could still pull me back to 1942, whether I wanted to go or not. Eventually, inevitably, we spoke about that day in the Indian Ocean. He described it again, this time not on paper, but in halting words, his hands moving slightly as if they still controlled wings and throttle. He told me how the ship had looked from above, how small the men seemed until he focused on them, how the ocean had reflected the sun in a way that made his eyes ache. He described the moment he had lined up the boat, the orders in his head, the weight of expectation on his finger. Then he looked at me and said, very quietly, that he had seen my face. For a moment, I could not breathe. The image I had carried in my own mind for so long, the fire on the water, the overloaded boat, the roar of the approaching engine, now had another layer, another angle. The idea that the man in the cockpit, whose machine had filled the sky above us, had been close enough and focused enough to pick my face out of all that chaos felt almost impossible. And yet, sitting there in that small room, the afternoon light catching on the glass of his spectacles, I believed him. He said he did not know why his hand had moved the way it did. He had thought about it for years, he admitted, turning the decision over like a puzzle with no neat solution. Fear of punishment, habit of obedience, the drilled-in reflex to attack. These things had all been part of him, but so, it seemed, had something else. Some part of him had refused, in that instant, to reduce the men below to shapes and uniforms. Some part of him had seen me, not as an enemy, but as a human being drowning in oil and fire. He bowed his head then, as far as his age-stiff neck allowed, and said he was sorry. Sorry for the ship, sorry for the men who had died, sorry for the friend I had lost behind that wall of flame, sorry that he had been up there at all. It was not a grand apology. It did not try to cover the whole war. It was one man, in one room, speaking to another about one moment they had shared from opposite sides of the sky. I realized, as he spoke, that the anger I had expected to feel was not there. There had been a time in the years after the war when the mere thought of Japanese pilots had made my jaw clench. The image of those red circles on wings against blue sky had been enough to send my heart racing and my hands into fists. But decades had passed, grinding the sharp edges of hatred into something duller and more complicated. I had seen my own country send young men into other wars. I had watched new enemies be named, new slogans raised. The more I lived, the more it seemed that war was a machine that chewed up boys from any nation it could reach. I told him, in simple words he could understand, that I did not forgive the war. I would never forgive what it had done to Wilkins, to the other men on my ship, to the countless faces under the waves and in the ruins. But I could, I found, forgive him for being 19, and in a cockpit with orders in his ears instead of words in his heart. And I could be grateful without any reservation that in that one moment, with me in his sights, he had chosen not to kill. We sat together until the light began to fade. Our families brought tea and snacks we mostly ignored. Photographs were produced, black and white images of young men in uniforms that looked too large for them, holding cigarettes and mugs and each other, grinning at cameras they could not imagine would outlive them. He showed me a picture of himself beside his aircraft, goggles pushed up on his forehead, chest puffed out with the proud foolishness of youth. I showed him a photograph of my old crew, taken on deck months before the sinking, all of us squinting into sunlight, Wilkins in the front row, grinning as if the world could not possibly have anything worse in store for him than another bad cup of tea. At one point, Yamada reached out with a hand that shook and touched the edge of that photograph. He traced very lightly the line of the ship's rail, the curve of the hull visible behind us, the faint blur of the sea. Then his finger hovered over Wilkins's face. "This one," he asked softly, his accent wrapping around the words. "Your friend?" I swallowed and nodded. "Yes." He bowed his head again, just a fraction, and withdrew his hand. When it was time to leave, we stood facing each other, two old men propped up by sticks and willpower, the weight of an ocean and a war and 70 years of life between us, and yet somehow also under our feet. We shook hands, the gesture as awkward and formal as it had been the first time we practiced it as boys, but more meaningful than anything clever we might have said. On the flight home, as the jet traced a line of white across the same sky that had once been filled with very different aircraft, I closed my eyes and let the years blur. I saw the sea on fire and my friend drowning 3 feet away. I saw the bomber lining up on our boat, the red circles on its wings, the way it had rolled away. I saw a young Japanese pilot staring down through a gun sight at a face half hidden by oil, his finger trembling on the trigger. I saw 2 old men in a small room sharing tea and silence, and a story only they could truly understand. For most of my life, I had told myself that I survived that day by accident. Now, looking back from the far side of it all, I knew that was not true. I had survived because, for one brief moment above a patch of burning water, a boy in another uniform had chosen, against everything he had been taught, to be human. And in the end, that single fragile choice had reached across decades and continents and found me in a room that smelled of boiled vegetables and disinfectant, offering something I had not known I still needed. It did not erase the war, nothing ever could, but it allowed me, at last, to remember that day on the Indian Ocean without feeling only fire and guilt. Somewhere in the middle of all that noise and death, there had also been a silence, and inside that silence, a mercy.